Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Sarah Seaton-Berghausen, Associate Curator of Collections at Duke University Libraries. I have the privilege of working with the literary collections in the Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke, including the William Styron papers, which are preserved and made accessible to researchers here. I am joined by our webinar's co-organizers, although some of us are behind the scenes. Amy McDonald, Assistant University Archivist, Meg Brown, Head of Exhibition Services, and Rachel Ingold, Curator of the History of Medicine Collections. We all wish we could have had this gathering in person, but we have such wonderful speakers lined up today. We wanted to go ahead online and hope you'll forgive us for any technical glitches. We are looking forward to this celebration of William Styron's groundbreaking memoir, Darkness Visible, with our discussion today, as we also recognize Mental Illness Awareness Week and Depression Awareness Month in October. The relationship of mental health to writing and other forms of creative expression is what we'll talk about today. It does seem especially important to do so in 2020 right now, as we're experiencing so much: the pandemic, extreme political division, wildfires, hurricanes, and as the systemic racism underlying all of this has been laid bare during these extraordinary times. We recognize the heightened trauma and suffering in particular of Black people, people who are poor, and others whose voices have been historically minimized. And we hope that today's discussion might provide insight and inspiration for all of us who are seeking ways to connect with one another, to help each other, and to improve our mental health. So first, a few logistics. We're presenting today's panel in webinar format, so you as participants will not be able to see or hear yourselves. That's just to minimize distractions and make it easier for everyone to hear our speakers. However, there will be time for questions at the end of the program, and I encourage you to type any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A function in Zoom. The speakers' talks are also being recorded and will be made available through the library's website after the event. And today we'll hear first from Professor of English James West, then from neurologist Dr. Sneha Mantri, and then Rachel will moderate a panel with Megha Gupta and Sarah Hodges, who are students at the Duke School of Medicine. I'd also like to take a moment before we begin to announce some wonderful news, which is that the library has received a gift to inaugurate the William Styron Prize in Creative Writing, thanks to the generosity of Duke alumni Merle and Roy Bostock, who are longtime friends of the Styron family. More information about the prize and details of our goal to create an endowment in Styron's honor will be posted to the exhibition website after this event. We hope the prize will provide more encouragement for students to express themselves in writing and to share that work. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Professor James L.W. West III. Dr. West is Professor of English Emeritus at Pennsylvania State University and a specialist in 20th century American literature, as well as book history and textual studies. He earned a PhD in English from the University of South Carolina and has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Well known as a scholar of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dr. West is also, of course, the biographer of William Styron and editor of several volumes of Styron's writings. In his most recent book, Making the Archives Talk, a topic near and dear to a librarian's heart, he outlines his views on editorial theory and on the use of archival documents to tell a story about how an author's work was conceived, composed, revised, polished, and finally published. His current work involves the genesis and composition of the memoir, Darkness Visible, which has been in no small part the inspiration for our discussion today. Dr. West, welcome.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that introduction. I'll move right into my presentation, and then we can go from there. This afternoon, as Sarah said, I want to talk about the inception and composition of William Styron's memoir, Darkness Visible. The published book, as you know, moves along quickly. The text is informative and accessible. A casual reader might think that the composition of such a work came easily to Styron, that it sprang into being fully formed, that the words and sentences flowed readily from his hand to the page and into print. Documentary evidence that's preserved in the William Styron papers at Duke, however, tells a more complex story. The manuscripts, typescripts, and proofs of Darkness Visible show that Styron struggled with the narrative, first attempting to tell the story as a novel, then as an essay, then as a speech, then as a magazine article, and only finally as a book. Today I'll tell how Styron composed Darkness Visible. I'll begin at the beginning with my recollections of a visit that I paid to him in the fall of 1985. As soon as I arrived at Styron's summer home in Martha's Vineyard that September, I could tell that something was not right. He was touchy and uncommunicative, abstracted and withdrawn. His conversation had a bitter, atrabilious quality. I did not know it then, but Styron was already well into an extended period of clinical depression. Within a few months, he suffered a full breakdown. He ceased to write and gave himself over to brooding. He fantasized about suicide and went so far as to attempt a farewell letter. Fortunately, with support from his family and particularly from his wife, Rose, he held back. On December 14th, 1985, he entered the psychiatric ward of Yale New Haven Hospital in an attempt to regain his psychological equilibrium. Well, as you know, Styron did recover. In February, he returned to his winter residence in Roxbury, Connecticut, and by June 1986, he was back on the vineyard. Remarkably, he was able to be candid about what he had been through and was quite curious about the constellation of factors that had laid him low. He was able to objectify his experience and to analyze his breakdown. He could even talk frankly about his desire the previous fall to end his life. Styron had read widely in the literature of melancholia. He had come to believe that depression was an illness, not a failure of will or a flaw in character. Depression, he had learned, could be cured or mitigated by treatment and understanding. Now he wanted to write about what he knew and about what he had been through, but in what form should he write and at what length? As a story, a novel, a memoir, an article, or a full-length book? In order to tell his story, Styron had to overcome his own innate reticence. He was a talkative man, but he revealed very little about himself in conversation, about his emotions and fears, ambitions and failures, vanities and regrets. He was articulate and observant, but almost never self-revelatory. He was therefore reluctant to set down in print for anyone to read an account of his profound depression and his impulses towards suicide. Styron eventually did overcome his reticence and wrote Darkness Visible, but it took time for him to do so. First, he attempted to relate his experience through the veil of fiction as a novel. Now I'm going to share the screen with you now and see if, can you all now, there we go. Can you see the manuscript? Good. Well, this is the first page of a novel that Styron attempted to write about his depression. It is a normal looking page of his manuscript. I think you'll be interested to see. Notice up here at the top that there are notes that he writes to himself. And then as he moves along, he always wrote on long yellow legal pads, always in #2 pencil. And notice that there are very few revisions, very few. He was able somehow, and I always envied him for this, to organize his sentences in his mind, what he wanted to say before he set them down on paper. And so you rarely see very much revision in his manuscripts. And I want you to remember that as we go along, because things will change later in this story. The manuscript of this untitled novel begins with a strong first episode, but in the pages that follow, the story begins to wander. Styron interpolates material about the history of depression and inserts short accounts of famous men who committed suicide. Ernest Hemingway, for example, and Randall Jarrell and James V. Forrestal. The material is of considerable interest, but it retards the fictional narrative. Styron seems to have recognized what was happening. He had produced some 16,000 words in all, and that's quite a start. But he decided with what must have been considerable reluctance to abandon the effort. Well, Styron now attempted to do the logical thing, that is to write a non-fiction account of what he had been through. And there survive in the Styron Papers at Duke, 4 different false starts on a nonfiction account, an article. You can see, this is page 6 of one of those false starts, how he begins. It is easy to become beset by hesitations when thinking of setting down a personal chronicle of one's own mental illness. And much of this particular page, again, notice not much revision, but much of it has to do with his reluctance to reveal what had happened to him. Down here at the bottom, you see the little check mark toward the middle of the page. One of the chief hesitations in my own case lies in the certain foreknowledge that if my account is to serve any worthwhile purpose, I must be prepared to exhibit more of myself than either my sense of propriety or instinct for privacy would ordinarily allow me to do. And I think that's typical of people who have suffered from depression. They must overcome a great deal of reluctance in order to talk about it. Styron had almost decided to abandon his effort entirely when a set of circumstances that are almost accidental in retrospect put him back into motion. On April 11th, 1987, the Italian writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi committed suicide. In late November of the following year, New York University held a conference on Levi's writings and life. A report on the event appeared in the New York Times on November 26, 1988. According to this report, some of the participants in the conference seemed to feel that Levi's suicide revealed a failure of will, that it was a shameful act. Styron read this account with considerable vexation, and the next day he set down a 1,200-word response and sent it to the Times. His remarks were published as an op-ed on Monday, December 19th, under the title, "Why Primo Levi Need Not Have Died." And here you see an image of that op-ed from the New York Times. In this short essay, Styron revealed that 3 years before he had flirted with the idea of suicide, but had been saved by rest and treatment. Styron's op-ed prompted numerous readers to send letters to the Times. 3 were published and others were forwarded to Styron. He was surprised by the response. He had not imagined that he would touch such a nerve with the public. The op-ed brought Styron an invitation to speak at a symposium on affective illness at Johns Hopkins University in the spring of 1989. He accepted the invitation, and now finally, with the presentation scheduled, Styron found his voice. He wrote out by hand a 15-page speech for the event, detailing his descent into melancholia and his decision to submit himself to treatment. This handwritten speech, like all of the other documents I've mentioned, is among his papers at Duke. Shortly after the symposium at Johns Hopkins, Styron agreed to deliver the same speech at the first meeting of the American Suicide Foundation in New York on May the 2nd, 1989. One of the people who heard him speak on that occasion was Tina Brown, who was then the editor of Vanity Fair. Shortly after the event, she contacted Styron and asked him to expand the speech into an article for Vanity Fair. She offered him unlimited space to set forth all he wanted to say. So what Styron did, as you can see from this next document, was to take the typed copy of his speech, the copy from which he had read on the podium, and he began to work on it. And you'll see here that he is transforming a text meant to be read aloud into a text meant for print. There are at least 3 different levels of revision here in which he transforms or moves text around, adds text. You'll see that he has typed some different text at the bottom that he then puts up in the top, and he's done some more handwritten revision. This is very unusual in Styron's composition. Usually, as I have said, he wrote down on the manuscript what he wanted to say, and what is in the handwritten manuscript is very close to what appears in print. But here he is working in a lapidary fashion, a layered fashion, to add detail and personal reference in order to make this a different sort of document. Darkness Visible was published in Vanity Fair in December of 1989, and again the response was immediate. The magazine received letters from readers who were grateful for Styron's command of language and felt that he had at last given voice to what they had experienced. For almost the first time in his literary career, Styron began to have a sense of shared experience with his readers. He had not before felt a close emotional connection to them. Early in 1990, Robert Loomis, also a Duke alumnus and Styron's editor at Random House, suggested that the Vanity Fair article might be turned into a small book, and Styron agreed. He expanded the Vanity Fair text by about 4,500 words, telling the story of a trip to Paris in October 1985, during which he realized for the first time that he was likely headed for a breakdown. Styron gave that manuscript to Loomis early in the spring of 1990, and the book was put immediately into print and these or into proofs. And you see here are some proofs in which Styron is again expanding and adding and rethinking the writing that he has already done. So, as I have said, this is most unusual for Styron to do this kind of expansion and rewriting in his works. Darkness Visible was formally published in October of 1990. This is the dust jacket of the first edition. Reviews were almost uniformly positive, and the book made its way to the top of the New York Times bestseller list a few weeks later. The book has since been translated into numerous languages and read all over the world. The original Random House edition has never been out of print. Well, from this talk, I hope you will take away 2 points. First, the composition of Darkness Visible was difficult for Styron. He had to overcome his own reluctance to make public his battle with depression. I think this is typical of people who suffer from the affliction. Styron's message was to seek help. Second, the composition of Darkness Visible proceeded in stages by accretion. I think this was obvious from the documents you have seen today. The result was a layered piece of writing. One might almost say a lapidary work. That layered quality is evident in the text. Much is held back and much is only suggested. So I hope you have some idea of the complexity of the composition of Darkness Visible. As with many important literary works, the surface of the writing, polished and luminous, conceals a great deal of thought and labor. Styron was aware of the importance of the small book that he had produced. He came to believe that Darkness Visible would stand as a record of his fight against affective illness, and that it would outlast him, bringing hope to people who, like him, had battled depression to a draw. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor West. We really appreciate your talk and hearing more about the stages of Styron's writing and work. Let's see if we can stop your screen share as we move on to our next guest. Wonderful.
There we go.
Thank you again. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Ingold, and I'm the curator for the History of Medicine collections in the Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next guest panelist, Dr. Sneha Mantri. Dr. Mantri is a neurologist and director of the Trent Center's Medical Humanities program here at Duke University, where she teaches seminars in medical humanities and illness narratives to pre-meds, medical students, and others. She received her Doctorate of Medicine, as well as a Master of Science in Narrative Medicine, both from Columbia University. Dr. Mantri's academic interests are in the imaginative formation of physicians, particularly the use of creative writing to improve physician understanding of the patient experience and to mitigate physician burnout. Her narrative medicine projects have been presented at numerous conferences. And as a clinical movement disorders specialist, she's involved in patient-physician communication initiatives sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the Parkinson's Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mantri.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Rachel, for that incredible introduction. I'm really thrilled to be able to be here virtually with you all today because Darkness Visible really is one of those books that really holds a lot of meaning to me in my career. Just share screen. So, you know, as Rachel mentioned, I'm Director of Medical Humanities here at Duke and an Assistant Professor of Neurology. And in both of those roles, I think a memoir about a struggle with depression and mental illness are hugely valuable in my own understanding of what, for instance, some of my patients may be going through, but it also has a lot of real significance for me sort of personally and professionally. I came to this book as an undergraduate student at the University of Virginia. I was a biochemistry major, doing all the kind of usual pre-med things, working in a lab, studying for the MCAT, and I was really, in my second year of undergrad, I was starting to have kind of a crisis of faith, if you will, and trying to decide if I really wanted to pursue a career in medicine or if I wanted to take sort of a real left turn, if you will, and go back to the thing that first excited me, which was storytelling and literature. And I was really kind of juggling these two ideas and trying to decide which path I was going to go down. And as a second year student, I took a seminar in the spring semester taught by David Morris, who's since retired from UVA. The seminar was titled Literature and Medicine. And that's where I first encountered Darkness Visible. It was one of a number of books that we read by patients and by physicians about their experiences, and was, I think, the first real indication that there was overlap between these two fields and these two areas of my life, of medicine and of literature. I mean, it sounds very strange almost to say now, because literature and medicine and narrative medicine is so widespread over the last decade. But at the time, it was really kind of my first exposure to the fact that this could be a viable sort of option for me. And that's actually what took me up to Columbia for my medical education, because they had started this new dual degree program where I obtained the MD as well as the master's in narrative medicine, and really, I think, shifted the course of my career in ways that I had no idea how to imagine as an undergrad student. In particular, one of the things that I think being part of the Trent Center and being here at Duke and having that training in medical humanities has enabled me to do, or allowed me to do, is start to write again. I'm, as Rachel mentioned, I'm a clinician first and foremost, and I see patients, 3 days a week in the clinic, and the stories that patients tell are so profound and so moving at times that taking those stories in and not knowing what to do with them, I think, was, at least for me, initially a real driver towards burnout and moral injury. And so what I started to do as a medical student, and have continued to do now, is write. This is just an image of a page from my notebook this is about a year or so ago. But, stories, both fiction and nonfiction, that derive from, and I think are drawn from, medical experience, I think makes me a better doctor, and it makes me a better writer. So again, this memoir was really the foundation of that career trajectory for me. So I'll always be grateful, I think, to William Styron for that. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was just the different opportunities that we have through the Trent Center here at Duke. Our website is trentcenter.duke.edu. There's a number of different events and so on that are posted, in a number of classes and seminars that we offer for people across the health system as well as on the university side. One of the things that I think we're really trying to do right now in this kind of very uncertain time is try to help people, both clinical and university, build a shared sense of community and a sense of shared experience. You know, we're all kind of in our COVID bubbles or working from home and very physically isolated from each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to be emotionally isolated from each other. And I think that's one of the things, again, coming back to Darkness Visible, that William Styron really makes clear in the book, is the interplay and the interlinkage between writers, other artists, other musicians. For instance, when you all joined the webinar, you heard the piece from Brahms that sort of Styron credits with helping him to lift out of his depression and commit to seeking treatment for the first time. And I think that interlinkage and that interplay between different forms of creative work is really kind of at the core of what we're doing at Trent, particularly, as I said, right now with all the social distancing and physical distancing restrictions, and trying to kind of form different types of communities across Duke. So I just wanted to sort of leave you all with this image of a ginkgo leaf, and this ginkgo leaf, it's beautiful in isolation, but think just how much more beautiful it is with all of the other ginkgo leaves around it, and really kind of helping us to see how small things can grow into larger things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montry. It was really wonderful to hear more about your experiences as a medical student and undergraduate, but especially what your work is entailing now and the work of the Trent Center. Thank you for sharing that as a resource for people who are watching. For the next portion of our event, I have the pleasure of speaking with Megha Gupta and Sarah Hodges, two medical students here at the Duke University School of Medicine. Before we start our conversation, I wanted to remind everyone that you have the opportunity to add questions, and in about 15 minutes, we'll start our question and answer with all four panelists from today. So please do feel free to type in questions into the bottom of the screen, and we look forward to a robust Q&A in a little bit. Let me introduce our next two speakers. Megha Gupta received her Bachelor of Science from the University of Southern California and is a current third-year medical student at Duke University School of Medicine. She helps to facilitate the Chronic Health Conditions Storytelling Group, which uses storytelling and its analysis as a creative outlet for students with chronic health conditions. She believes that helping people with chronic illness understand, represent, and share their stories is an incredibly empowering act and will also assist her as a future physician to better help her patients navigate their own illnesses. Sarah Hodges studied English literature at Yale College, where she focused on literary criticism as well as personal narrative construction and the autobiographic process. Currently, she is an MD candidate at the Duke University School of Medicine. She believes that reading literature can be a potent force for inspiring empathy, and that writing can be an empowering and deeply therapeutic process. I'd like to thank both Sarah and Megha for taking time out of their very busy medical student schedules to speak with us today. It's wonderful to have you. And as we're recognizing the anniversary of Styron's work, I thought I would begin by asking a question. Have you read Darkness Visible? And if so, when did you read it and how did it impact you? And let's begin with you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a great question. I have read Darkness Visible, and I read it in the sort of liminal in between years between college and medical school. I was working in clinical neuroscience research, and specifically, I was working with people who use cocaine and other drugs and were trying to stop. And so one of the really compelling things for me about that was sort of the kind of societal narrative or stigma about addiction as a sort of moral failing, rather than recognizing it as a biochemical disease with a profile similar to diabetes or cancer. So coming across Styron's work and sort of seeing the way that he so lucidly made a really compelling argument for depression and other mental illnesses that might, be invisible, making them visible and putting them sort of on the same page as these other diseases. And I guess to say a bit more about the work, if I can.
Please.
Mr. Styron has this beautiful quote that, says that a great book should leave you with many experiences and slightly exhausted because you live several lives while you read it. And that's not from this work, but to me, that seems to just be so beautiful and really encompass like what the work of literature is, right? Of letting you enter into someone else's subjective experience and see the world through their eyes. And that is the way to sort of make inroads and forge sort of connections between people who may at face value feel like they don't have so much in common. So, I think he really does incredible work of making what he calls the indescribable nature of the disease, making the ineffable, sort of being able to give words to that, and then help outsiders to sort of be able to grasp what he calls the true contours of the pain of the disease. So yes, it was very sort of impactful in my understanding and development as a thinker and now a soon-to-be clinician.
Thank you. Megha, are there books or memoirs about depression or health that you've read as an undergraduate or as a medical student that have made an impact with you? And can you describe what those works may be?
Yeah, there are tons of works, actually, I think that, talk about mental health and depression in particular. Sarah and I both work with the Chronic Health Conditions Storytelling Group, where we actually kind of work together to analyze these illness narratives and share them with students who have chronic illnesses. Works that we've analyzed together that I think have stuck out to me a lot have one that comes to mind in particular is Night Walks by Charles Dickens. It's one of his short stories, primarily about insomnia, but he actually references all sorts of mental illness throughout and does such a beautiful job of describing it and bringing the reader into a much better understanding of having the illness itself. He talks about depression. He calls it the dry rot, which is such a visual way of kind of allowing the reader to get a sense of what having that sort of mental illness would be like. And I think reading through descriptions like that have really aided me as a clinician or as a future clinician in being able to relate to my patients much better too. Other works that we've read, one recommended by Dr. Munthry actually was Journal of a Disappointed Man by W.N.P. Barbellion, and that was an illness narrative about a man with MS. And he also kind of talks about all of the emotional aspects that go with that, and he talks about going into depression and all the societal pressures that come with having a chronic illness and the interplay with his mental health there too. So those are two really impactful works that I've read that have really helped me understand and better connect with patients and folks who do have chronic illness that we've met in the clinical spheres.
Great, thank you. The next question is for you both. And I want to ask you about stress. 2020 has been a very stressful year for everyone. There is a lot of stress right now, and I imagine you all are under a lot as well. There's the stress and the joy of being in medical school. There's the stress of being a healthcare provider in general, but especially right now during a pandemic. There's the stress of racial injustice and so much more. How do you all handle and deal with the stress that you are under? It's a very personal question, but we'd like to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to start out. You're right, Rachel. There's so much stress. It's really hard to kind of think about all the ways in which we probably cope. But in thinking about it, I think the first thing I try to do is compartmentalize, like think about what are things I can control and what are things out of my locus of control. And I think that is the hardest part when feeling like everything's out of hand. But setting aside time apart from my medical training to do things that I enjoy and revisiting those, things like literature, reading, connecting with family and friends, and then turning frustrations into actionable items, I think is the last thing. Trying to get people out to vote, or trying to go to a protest, or trying to be part of the movement to make things better when things do feel unmanageable, have all kind of been ways that I've tried to work through the stresses of 2020.
Great.
I would echo that, and I think I would also, add, so, trying to sort of go back and reconnect and remember sort of the person that maybe you were during a less stressful time, and reconnecting to those things that you enjoyed and the people that have meaning in your life, and also remembering sort of your values and what was it that got you to the place that you are now, and what are sort of like those motivating principles. I know that I don't know who said this, but that you can kind of sustain any what if you have a why. And so I think going back to that kind of like first principles seems to really help. And I think that one other thing is I think everyone is maybe facing a bit of Zoom fatigue, right? So and I don't know if maybe other people can say if they've encountered this too, that technology is so wonderful, but at a certain point, there's really a performative quality that comes to kind of maybe the interactions that you would have with your friends in person. You don't really have that, right? You don't have the easy organic nature of it. So I know that one suggestion that I found to be helpful is to, talk to someone, a friend of yours, and instead of putting so much pressure to have a funny story or be able to kind of talk constantly, just act as if you would otherwise. So, have the Zoom on, but then knit or crochet or, paint, do whatever you would do otherwise together. And then, you can chat, but then that kind of removes the stress and forced nature that I think we can sometimes feel these days and months.
Well said, both of you. And just to echo what my wonderful colleague Sarah Berghausen said at the introduction, we really had hoped that this event could be in person. But thank you both for those for sharing your comments. Megha, you mentioned the chronic, I'm going to get it wrong, the chronic
Health condition storytelling group. Yeah.
Chronic health condition storytelling group. I was curious if both of you could share other resources that you might know of for medical students who are watching this, but also for our undergraduate and graduate student populations. Dr. Montry had mentioned the Trent Center, but do you all know of other resources in the community for our students to be able to reach out to?
So, I mean, for mental health issues, I think primarily it's really, I think Duke does a good job of trying to address that, and has actually been doing a really great job during these social distance days, to offer CAPS, which is counseling and psychological services for their students. And I know I've personally used their services and they've been really great and accommodating. So that's definitely one big resource that I think people can go to in times of darkness for themselves. And then I think our storytelling group has actually been really great for people with chronic health conditions on campus. It's a really small community, or it can feel like a small and isolating community, I should say. But we've been surprised by our own numbers of people who come and enjoy and can share and kind of commune with each other in that environment. Not necessarily just for the storytelling, but also to have that support with other folks who have chronic illness.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. And just to add on to it, it's been a wonderful community for people, undergrads and graduate students, but also for people who work at Duke and employees to come and have this community for people who are living with chronic illnesses, or anyone who, has a loved one with a chronic illness, because the reality is that illness touches all of us in its own way. And for that group, I guess I'll just say that we've gotten some really wonderful feedback that I think is helpful in this forum too, just to share about the role of writing and the role of being able to kind of share. And like what Dr. West said, sort of there was, this challenge of making yourself vulnerable to be able to sort of share a part of yourself, of William Styron, that he thought could really help a lot of people, but had a hesitance about it. And so the feedback that we've gotten was just the opportunity to talk to other people who kind of get it in some way, is that, hearing other people's stories have been really powerful and have given a sense of solidarity. And so we have this format where, we do some readings together, we do an icebreaker, but then we give a writing prompt. We all have like 5 or 7 minutes, and then everyone's invited to share what they read. And the feedback that we've gotten is that, that format, people thought they wouldn't like it, but they did like it because it forced them past their self-consciousness, that maybe their stories weren't good enough, and really just echoed that there is power in hearing someone else's story and finding things that you have in common. So, I think that's the one other thing about it. I think between people, even, friends, there can feel like there are these walls that inhibit us from being vulnerable. But I think more often than not, it takes courage and vulnerability to be the first person to be vulnerable. But I think, these sort of things are much more common than we might realize. And so sharing something can, lead to kind of mutual sharing, and then just sort of strengthening a friendship, and sort of it provides a lot of reassurance to realize that you're not as alone as you thought.
I think that's a great way for us to end our conversation. Thanks to you both so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you also to our other panelists, Professor West and Dr. Montry.